Hello everyone. I'm going to devote my remarks today not so much to the economics of Bastiat, but rather to his political and legal philosophy, because Bastiat very wisely put down his thoughts in this little book that the Foundation for Economic Education has long published. The law. And I recommend that everybody read this book. It's the kind of book you should maybe read a couple times a year because it's very important, it's very short, and I'm always amazed by how much Bastiat was able to say in such a short space. People who want to write, I think, also should study this as a way, in order to learn how to write economically, and I'm meaning economically in the other sense now. Few words, but saying so much with a few words. Every time I read this book, and I've read it many times over the years, it's one of the earliest books I read when I was discovering this view, liberalism. Every time I read it, I am impressed by how relevant this book is. He writes it toward the end of his life. He dies in 1850. And yet this book could be written today by a contemporary and be having in mind the very issues that are being debated in the United States and just about every other country. So it's really rather incredible that someone writing in 1849, 1850 speaks for the ages, because these are the kinds of issues that unfortunately won't go away. I don't think liberty ever has a final victory. I think it's the sort of thing that every generation has to guard and fight for. If they have it, they have to preserve it. If they don't have it, they have to fight to get it. So I think this is going to be something that every generation faces. I don't think we're going to come to nirvana or utopia someday where liberty is sort of guaranteed for all time and we don't have to worry about it anymore. A few people have said that the eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, and I think that is true. Unfortunately, eternal, but I think that's the way it is. Bastiat, in a very simple and almost poetic way, somebody else earlier referred to the poetry of Bastiat, and I think that's a good word. This book almost is poetry. Begins by discussing what the law even is. What is law? Why do we need law? Where did it come from? And he tells us early on that law is not, he rejects what we call legal positivism. The idea that law is simply what the legislature says, and anything that the legislature says is law. You can actually see this view rejected by Bastiat in his book, where he makes it clear that these are my words now, not hers, but his, but there is genuine law and there is counterfeit law. There are things that masquerade as law, but are not true law. Even though a legislature passes it, even though a president signs it, even if a Supreme Court says it's okay, that does not make it law by Bastiat's standards and by our standards and by, I think, proper moral standards. Because Bastiat points out that the only reason we need law is because life, liberty, and property need protection. This is true. I mean, if you look at John Locke and the state of nature, we get along fairly well, all of us, trading and dealing with each other in a civil manner for the most part. Society kind of can run itself. Many liberal thinkers have thought this. You find this in Thomas Paine. You find it in Mises and Hayek and Bruno Leoni, a great liberal legal scholar, Italian scholar of our time. He dies, I think, in the 60s, but I mean in modern times. And so the law is not the product of government, not the product of legislatures, but it's the product simply of human nature and human need to preserve life, liberty, and property so that we may prosper, so that we may engage in exchange, cooperation, division of labor, and improve our situation, our material situation. And not just material, but I'll concentrate on that since economics is such an important part of Bastiat's thinking, but it's clear that he's not only interested in material values. So this is where the need for law comes from, and in fact this is where law comes from. Law precedes legislatures, law precedes governments. It arises out of custom and emerges. This is a word that's becoming very popular among free market thinkers in the U.S. If you look at the blog, a very good blog, Cafe Hayek, that is run by Russell Roberts and Donald Boudreaux, Donald Boudreaux being a former president of FEE. This word is very popular. Emergent institutions. This is refers to Hayek's views on spontaneous order, where institutions like markets, like law, emerge, not planned. And I think you see this in Bastiat, at least implicitly. Out of our need to cooperate in order to prosper, and our need to protect our life, liberty, and property, because there can be predators who would take those things, we have need for devices, institutions of protection. And so this is true at the individual level for Hayek, for Bastiat, and then when we get together, there's what he calls the collective right, which is simply an extension of the individual right to protect one's life, liberty, and property, using force if necessary. Bastiat obviously is not a pacifist, and most liberals have not been pacifists, because they believe that force is properly used as a last resort in order to protect life, liberty, and property, to protect the innocent against the predators. And this is where it all comes from. And Bastiat makes some very interesting points about this. First of all, it's very clear that this is something derived from individuals. It's not something that, it's not that the sum is not, the whole is not greater than the sum of its parts in this respect. The collective, as he calls it, the collective right, in other words, the society, does not have rights that the individuals themselves do not possess. There's no way that you could get that, right? If you have separate individuals, each with the right to life, liberty, and property, and the right to use force if necessary to protect it, if they get together and pool the resources to do this, you don't get additional rights. And so what no individual can do, the group together cannot do. This is a very important point that Bastiat makes early on in the book. He roots it in the individual, which makes him a methodological individualist. You could say it makes him a praxeologist. And of course, Mises, when Mises wrote about praxeology, Mises didn't believe he was inventing a method. He might have been inventing a word, but he wasn't inventing a method. He understood that the economists that preceded him were implicitly using this method of focusing on the individual, looking at the logic of action, and then tracing out the implications. And he had people like Bastiat in mind, the French economists, the Scottish economists in mind when he was writing about this. And you see this in Bastiat again, in terms of law. It's interesting, you can see it in terms of economics, but then also in terms of law. So the group, society, can have no rights that individuals don't possess. And so this is where he derives his points about the perversion of law. If the purpose of law originally, if law emerged in order to protect life, liberty, and property, and it maintains that character when people get together in order to have strength in numbers and pool their resources in order to live better and then also be able to protect themselves. When the law then is changed and becomes a tool of predation, then law has turned against itself, and you get this fatal contradiction that Bastiat writes about. Law now is an agent of plunder, and of course he uses the term legal plunder quite often in this book. And he shows that this is a contradiction, and a very bad contradiction, which he says also, and I believe this is a very important point that maybe is overlooked in his book, creates a moral confusion in people. Because now we get a conflict between law on the one hand, or what is cold law, it's not true law, but it's cold law,